I never thought I'd find myself working in a place like this, but life has a way of steering you toward the jobs you least expect. And so, here I am, Ethan White, 35 years old, caretaker of the Orchard House, the most terrifying Airbnb you'll ever stay in, though of course we don't advertise it that way. On the website, it's called the Orchard House, 1896, a quaint Victorian with lace curtains, a creaking porch swing, and glowing 5-star reviews that read more like coded warnings than real recommendations. But I suppose not everyone reads between the lines, and that's how they end up here. That's how I ended up here too, lured by the promise of good pay and a free room, told only that I'd need to respect the house's rules, as though I was applying to be a babysitter for a child I hadn't met. But I took it anyway because rent was choking me, and because curiosity is a weed I've never been able to kill. They handed me the rules on a yellowed card the first night. 4 simple lines. Too simple almost. Always check in after dark. Never open a door you didn't close. If the upstairs hall light flickers, count to 10 before moving. At checkout, leave a glass of water on the kitchen table. That's it. 4 rules that seem harmless until you realize how impossible it is to follow them once the house decides you're interesting. The first time I stood at the gate waiting for a guest, I thought it was a joke, a marketing gimmick to set the mood. But when you work here long enough, you start to see the scenes. You start to notice the way the swing on the porch keeps moving, even when the night air is dead still, or how the bay window in the parlor doesn't quite keep up with your reflection, lagging behind just enough to remind you that the house has eyes of its own. And sometimes, when you're washing dishes in the kitchen, you'll catch a smear of condensation shaped like a hand pressed hard against the glass of the cabinet doors, though nobody's inside. Tonight feels different though, heavier, and as I stand by the gravel drive waiting for my newest guest, I find myself gripping the brass key so tightly the ribbon cuts into my palm, because the calendar says this one is a last-minute booking, just a single name, L. Rowan. No photo, no message, no cheerful request about extra towels or late check-in, just the reservation and a timestamp that makes me wonder if the house itself wrote it. I can hear the crickets chirring beyond the orchard, the branches rattling like teeth, when headlights crest the bend and wash the white clapboard exterior in a harsh glow, and a silver hatchback rolls slowly up the path. It sits there for too long, engine running, driver unmoving, and I feel the key twitch against my skin as though it wants to turn itself. And then at last the window slides down and a woman leans toward me. Her face pale and too composed, like she's been rehearsing this moment for years, her eyes searching mine with a question she already knows the answer to. "Is this the Orchard House?" she asks, voice measured, and I nod, holding out the key, though my hand doesn't feel like my own anymore. "I'll remind you of the rules," I tell her, but she cuts me off with a smile that isn't a smile, brittle and thin, and says, "I already know them. I've been here before." Which makes no sense because the booking history shows no trace of her, no duplicate names or repeat visits, and yet the way she says it, the calm certainty in her tone makes my stomach twist. Because if she has been here before, it means she either broke the rules and somehow survived, or she never truly left at all. The porch swing creaks once behind me, though the night is perfectly still, and the orchard groans like something large is moving just out of sight. But I can't turn around. I don't dare because her eyes are locked on mine, and she hasn't looked away once since she spoke. And for the first time in months, I feel less like the caretaker of this house and more like its prisoner, standing guard at a gate I no longer control, wondering if tonight's guest has come back to pay her debt or to collect mine.
Inside the Orchard House, the rules live heavier than the walls, and I always feel them press against me as soon as the front door shuts, like the air itself wants to whisper, "Remember." So I lead the woman, Rowan, though she hasn't given me her first name, across the foyer where the floorboards moan in protest and into the parlor where the antique radio sits on its crooked stand, a relic that hasn't picked up a station in decades, yet hums sometimes when the wind crawls through the chimney. She doesn't look at the furniture or the paintings the way most guests do, doesn't comment on the smell of old wood and mothballs, doesn't even glance at the portrait of the Orchard family who built this house, the ones who never left, at least not entirely. Instead, she goes straight to the hall table, where I set down the laminated card of rules, her eyes scanning the 4 lines like she's measuring them against memory. And when I start to recite them out loud, as I do for every guest, she cuts in, finishing the sentences with me in a low voice. Always check in after dark, never open a door you didn't close. If the hall light flickers, counts at 10, leave a glass of water on the kitchen table. And she says them with a rhythm that makes my skin crawl, like she's repeating a prayer she once learned in childhood but never believed in. And I have to swallow before I can speak again, because it's one thing to read the rules, another to live by them. And the only people who know the difference are the ones who've spent a night here and left with shadows stitched into their bones. That's all you need to remember, I say weakly, but she tilts her head and murmurs, "No, that's not all." And I want to ask what she means, but the house doesn't like questions spoken aloud, not about things it hasn't admitted. So instead, I hand her the brass key on its velvet ribbon, and for the briefest second, when our fingers touch, the key pulses warm between us, like a vein, and she flinches before slipping it into her pocket as though it might burn a hole through the fabric. I direct her upstairs to the bay room, the one at the end of the hall where the wallpaper curls and the closet faces the wrong way, though I don't tell her that part. And as she climbs, the upstairs hall light flickers once, then steadies, like it's taking attendance. And she pauses, hand on the banister, glancing back at me with a small, brittle smile before disappearing around the corner. I stay downstairs because that's my place, caretaker not companion, and I put the kettle on like I always do, ginger and something bitter the house taught me to crave. When I hear it, the click of the front door latch, soft, precise, too deliberate to be the wind. And when I turn my head, I see it's open just 2 inches, letting in a draft that chills my skin. Every part of me wants to cross the foyer and push it shut, but the second rule burns against my chest like a brand. Never open a door you didn't close. And I know if I disobey, the house will mark me. So I stand rooted to the kitchen tile, pulse hammering, as the door groans wider by another inch, as though invisible fingers are easing it open. "Ethan," the guest calls from upstairs, her voice tight, uncertain, and I snap back to myself, realizing she's breaking the unspoken rhythm of the house. Guests aren't supposed to leave their rooms yet, not until the walls have decided where they belong. And I shout up, "Stay there, don't come down," but I can hear her steps on the stairwell anyway, the careful weight of someone torn between fear and curiosity. And the front door swings wider, 6 inches now, framing nothing but the black yard and the orchard beyond, the rows of trees shifting in ways they shouldn't, like figures moving just out of sight. I clutch the counter's edge so hard my nails squeal against the laminate, and then, mercifully, horribly, the door swings back on its hinges, slow and smooth, until the lock clicks and the bolt hums faintly like a satisfied throat clearing. The air loosens, but not enough. And when I look to the staircase, she's already halfway down, her hand white-knuckled on the rail, her eyes fixed not on me, but on the parlor, where the radio has begun to hum a steady note, thin and mournful, vibrating through the wood floorboards into our bones. "Was it always 4 rules?" she asks, her voice sharp, trembling with something I can't name. And before I can answer, before I can deny or deflect, the upstairs hall light flickers again. Once, twice, then a stuttered burst of pulses, 9 fast, 3 slow, like code tapped against a coffin lid, and the house swallows the sound of my breath, waiting to see what I'll do. I raise my hand automatically, instinctively, because there's only one response I've learned to give, and I start to count, whispering into the silence. 7, 8, 9, 10, and as the final number slips past my lips, the light steadies again, the hum from the radio fades, and the front door remains obediently shut. She stares at me, not with fear, not even with relief, but with recognition, as though she's been waiting for me to prove I know the dance, and she whispers, "I remember that part, but I forgot the water," and my mouth goes dry, because I know what happens when people forget Rule 4, and if she truly did, then something has been waiting for her return, thirsty and patient, and the orchard house always collects what it's owed.
The thing about the orchard house is that it never forgets a debt. And when Rowan whispered that she'd once forgotten the water, I felt the weight of 100 silent nights pressing in on me. Every time I'd heard footsteps that weren't mine. Every time I'd seen the porch swing move with no wind. And I realized the house hadn't been restless these past few weeks for no reason. It had been waiting, preparing, because she was always going to come back. And maybe I was just the unlucky caretaker holding the key at the right moment. So I led her upstairs to the bay room, the air thick with dust and expectation, and set the guest book on the dresser the way I always do, though this time the spine crocked louder, like the book itself was stretching awake, and when she touched it, it fell open not to the first page or the most recent, but to the center, where an entry in cramped, spidery ink read, "I heard myself knock from outside," and beneath it another in neat block letters that said, "If a door opens toward you, it belongs to you. If it opens away, it never did." And I wanted to tell her to close the book, to leave it, because I knew too well how the entries sometimes wrote themselves. But she lingered, tracing the grooves of the words with her fingertip, like she was remembering something long buried. And when she finally closed the book, it was with a kind of reverence that made my stomach knot. She drifted toward the bay window, looking out at the orchard where the rows of trees bent inward in the fading light, and asked me in a voice too calm, "Do they ever write back?" And for a moment I couldn't breathe because she'd asked the one question I'd trained myself never to speak aloud, and when I finally managed to reply, my voice was thin and strained. "Sometimes," I said, "but you shouldn't read what they say." And she smiled faintly at her reflection in the glass, which smiled back a beat late, as it always does. But this time, I thought I saw something else there too. Something behind her, taller, darker, not moving quite in rhythm. And before I could blink, it was gone, leaving only her weary face staring at herself. "Last time, I left thirsty," she murmured, more to her reflection than to me. And I wanted to press her, to demand what that meant, but the house creaked in warning, a slow shift of wood that told me I didn't want me to ask. So I kept my mouth shut and placed the brass key on the nightstand, though even as I did, it hummed faintly, vibrating against the wood like it wanted to roll away. And Rowan watched it with eyes that had stopped looking tired and started looking expectant, like she was waiting for the house to show her something. And I hated how calm she seemed in a place that fed on unease. I made an excuse about checking the locks and left her standing by the window, but as I pulled the door nearly shut, leaving it just ajar so it still counted as mine, I heard a soft tick from the closet, the one that faces inward. And the sound was so slight I might have dismissed it as the house settling, except I know the difference. I've always known the difference. And that was the sound of something closing a door on the other side. I hurried down the stairs, each step creaking in its own rhythm. And when I reached the kitchen, the sight waiting for me nearly buckled my knees. A glass of water sat on the table, beaded with condensation, fresh and untouched, and beside it lay a thin twig from the orchard tied neatly with red thread, as though someone had completed Rule 4 early. But I hadn't poured the water, hadn't fetched the twig, and Rowan hadn't been downstairs, which meant the house itself had provided, or worse, that someone else had, someone who still remembered her last visit. I picked up the glass, my hand trembling, and the water inside shimmered faintly, like it was vibrating with a sound I couldn't hear. And for one foolish second, I thought about drinking it, about seeing what it would do. But then the radio in the parlor hummed a low note, almost like a warning, and I set the glass back down, backing away from the table. The orchard house never forgets, and I realized then that it wasn't just Rowan who was being tested tonight, it was me too. Because the rules aren't about keeping the guests safe, they're about keeping the house fed. And I couldn't shake the sick feeling that I was no longer just the caretaker, but part of the bargain, part of the ritual, maybe even part of the debt. And as I stood there with my hands shaking, I heard Rowan's voice drift down the stairs, soft and distant, though she hadn't moved from the bay room. "Ethan, was it always 4 rules? Or did you forget the 5th? And the house groaned like it was listening for my answer, but I didn't give one because I knew better. I've always known better. And instead, I backed into my pantry room, shut the door tight, and pressed my ear to the wood, listening as the floorboards above me creaked with the slow, deliberate steps of someone, or something, walking from the bay window to the closet that faces inward.
The orchard house doesn't give you rest when it knows you're rattled. And that night, as I lay in the cramped pantry room with the thin blanket pulled over me, I realized sleep was only a memory because every sound sharpened into a blade, pipes moaning like distant voices, the kettle on the stove rocking as if nudged by a hand I couldn't see, the faint static hum from the parlor radio bleeding through the walls like someone trying to tune in a frequency that didn't exist. And though my eyes stayed shut, my mind walked the upstairs hall where Rowan stood, imagining her at the bay window with the closet yawning open behind her, though I prayed she hadn't touched it, because doors that face inward don't open into rooms you can step inside, they open into you, into all the parts you never meant to reveal. And the house feeds best when you give it that freely. But around 3 a.m., the stillness broke with a sharp knock, not at my door, but from somewhere deeper, heavier, like someone rapping at the foundation stones themselves. And I shot upright, pulse skidding, because I knew I hadn't heard that in years. Not since the caretaker before me disappeared without his shoes, and the memory alone was enough to freeze me in place. Ethan? Rowan's voice drifted down again, soft, stretched thin, but there was something wrong in it, like it had been folded too many times and lost its shape. And though every bone in me screamed not to answer, I whispered back, "Don't open anything." Because even if she wasn't hearing me, maybe the house would. Maybe it would be satisfied. But then came the footsteps, deliberate, climbing the stairs in rhythm with my own heartbeat. And I remembered the second rule: never open a door you didn't close. And I pressed my back against the pantry wall, whispering over and over, "Not mine, not mine, not mine," until the sound passed overhead, moving slow and steady toward the bay room. The silence that followed was worse, thicker than any noise. And after an eternity of clutching my knees to my chest, I forced myself up and out into the kitchen, the house's air so damp it felt like wading through a swamp. And when I reached the table, the glass of water I'd left earlier was gone, replaced by a second glass, half empty, the surface still rippling like someone had just drunk from it. And beside it, the red threaded twig had untied itself into a neat line, spelling out what looked like a crude symbol, an eye, or maybe a loop, the same jagged shape carved into the basement door weeks ago when I thought I'd dreamed it. And I didn't even realize I'd been holding my breath until the radio hummed again, louder this time, rising into a wail like a violin bow drawn across bone. I stumbled back against the counter, clutching my chest, and that's when I saw Rowan at the bottom of the stairs, her hair loose, her face pale, and she whispered, "It's colder in the closet," though I hadn't asked, hadn't moved toward her, and my throat closed up, because I didn't know if she was hearing me from the hall or from somewhere else, somewhere behind her eyes. "You didn't open it, did you?" I croaked, and her lips curved into the smallest of smiles, brittle, knowing, before she whispered, "Not yet," and turned without a sound, drifting back upstairs like the house had pulled her on a string. I gripped the counter until my nails bent, wondering if I should run, if I should break the rules and drag her out by force. But the orchard house punishes those who take what it hasn't offered, and I've seen what it does, how it changes voices, how it bends faces. So instead, I lit the lantern I keep for emergencies, the flame quivering against the glass, and forced myself to follow, step by step, up the staircase where the hall bulb still burned steady, too steady, like an eye unblinking. And when I reached the bay room door, I found it ajar, even though I'd left it half closed, and my stomach twisted, because that meant the door no longer counted as mine. It belonged to something else now, and the house knew it. "Rowan?" I whispered, and the air smelled faintly of peppermint and iron, and from inside, I heard her laugh, soft and uneven, like water dripping from a cracked faucet, and I pushed the door open a fraction more, just enough to see the closet standing wide, its black mouth gaping inward, and Rowan kneeling before it, her hands stretched toward the darkness like a child reaching for candy, her face lit strangely by the lantern's glow, so that her eyes looked hollow, her cheeks sunken. And for a moment, I thought she wasn't herself anymore, thought she was a reflection pulled out of the window glass to wear her skin. I wanted to shout, to yank her away, but then something inside the closet shifted. A shape pressed against the inward-facing wall, like a body trying to come through, and it whispered my name, not hers, mine, Ethan. in a voice that sounded like my own, low and mocking, and the floorboards shivered under my feet as if urging me closer, daring me to cross the line. But I remembered the rule, the second one, and I froze, whispering the words to myself like armor. Never open a door you didn't close. And I knew if I touched that knob, if I leaned even a fraction further, it would count as mine, and whatever was inside would have me. Rowan turned her head then, slowly, her eyes finding mine, and she smiled, not with relief or fear, but with recognition, and whispered, "It remembers." Before the hall light flickered violently, 9 quick bursts, 3 slow, and then snapped back to steady, leaving me trembling in the doorway as the closet door creaked shut on its own, sealing whatever was inside, at least for now. And I realized the house wasn't just feeding on her debt, it was calling me to make one of my own.
I don't think I've ever felt the orchard house more alive than I did after that closet shut on its own, the air quivering with a satisfaction that wasn't mine, the floor under my feet pulsing like a vein, and every instinct in me said run. Leave Rowan, leave the rules, leave the job. But I couldn't, because the house had me tethered, because her words, "it remembers," still rang in my head. So I stepped back into the hallway, the lantern trembling in my hand, and whispered to myself that I'd count to 10, just to steady my nerves. But before I even reached 3, the upstairs bulb winked out, plunging everything into a suffocating dark. And from the parlor below came the crackle of the radio, not the soft hum I'd grown used to, but a jagged burst of static, like someone screaming through broken teeth. And I knew without knowing that the house was calling us downstairs, dragging us toward the kitchen where the water glass waited. Rowan followed, her bare feet soundless on the rug, her face empty of expression, eyes fixed straight ahead, and when I whispered her name, she didn't answer, didn't even blink, just kept walking until she reached the bottom step and paused, tilting her head toward the kitchen where the faint clink of glass echoed, like fingers drumming the rim of that half-empty cup. And the sound made my stomach lurch, because I knew no one was in there. Or rather, no one living. So I forced myself to move, to cross the foyer, and push into the kitchen where the lantern light fell across the table, revealing not 1 but 3 glasses now, lined up neatly, each filled to a different level, 1 brimming, 1 half, 1 nearly dry, and beside them the red thread from before coiled into a spiral, the same jagged loop symbol carved into the basement door. And I didn't want to admit it, but I recognized the pattern from the guest book, from that spidery handwriting, the way it always circled back into itself, like an eye that could never close. And Rowan's voice came from behind me, low and steady. "It drinks in thirds," she said. And when I turned, her face was ghost pale in the lantern glow, her lips barely moving. And she added, "1 for me, 1 for you, 1 for what waits." And before I could stop her, she reached out and lifted the middle glass, the half-full one, her hand steady as stone, and tipped it back in 1 swallow. I shouted, lunging forward, but it was too late. The water spilled past her lips, dripping down her chin, and her eyes rolled white for a second before snapping back sharp, brighter than before. Too bright. As if something else had slipped in through that drink, and she smiled with teeth that didn't feel like hers, and whispered, "Better." And the sound of it curdled my blood. I grabbed her wrist, trying to yank the glass from her hand, but it was already empty, and when I looked down, the other glasses had shifted, the brimming one now only half, the nearly dry one completely gone, and I didn't see where it went until the radio static rose again, and I heard my own voice, distorted and slow, leaking through the walls. "Ethan, Ethan, Ethan," over and over like a chant. And I knew then that I'd been marked. That whatever Rowan had owed, the house had claimed me as part of the payment. The lantern sputtered, the flame threatening to snuff out, and I slammed it down on the table, spilling heat against the wood, and in that orange glow, I saw the condensation on the glasses twist into writing, "Leave water, or it will drink you." And my knees went weak. Because suddenly Rule 4 didn't seem so simple anymore, not a courtesy, not a superstition, but a binding, and the house was reminding me what happens when you forget. Rowan's hand was still in mine, and it was cold, far too cold, colder than the night air outside, and when she finally spoke again, her voice was layered, like two voices speaking through the same throat. "You'll finish it for me," she said, and pulled free, retreating toward the staircase, leaving me standing in the kitchen with the glasses still trembling, the radio still muttering my name, and the knowledge that I was no longer just caretaker, but collateral, bound to rules I thought I understood but had only begun to glimpse. Rules that didn't just keep the house fed, but decided who among us would leave at dawn and who the orchard would keep behind. Thirsty forever.
I told myself I'd wait for daylight to make any real decisions, but the orchard house isn't a place where daylight means safety. It only means a different sort of honesty, the kind where shadows stop pretending to be anything but themselves. So, when Rowan vanished up the stairs, and the radio kept purring my name like a cat learning speech, I took the lantern in both hands and followed, counting under my breath, even though the hall bulb didn't flicker. 1, 2, 3. Because sometimes counting is the only rope you have across a river you can't see. The staircase groaned the way it always does, step 8 longer than it should be, step 10 warmer, and on step 12 I smelled peppermint and pennies again, the closet's breath, and I knew we were walking closer to the house's throat. "Rowan," I called, and my voice came back from the landing like it had been run through wool, soft around the edges, unfamiliar, and I hated that it sounded almost relieved because a part of me, a part I didn't recognize, felt grateful that the house had chosen me to witness whatever came next, like a parishioner invited behind the altar. The bay room door stood ajar again, but not in the careless way of earlier. This time it was open with ceremony, as though the door had been greeted and asked to attend. And when I stepped inside, the lantern drew a trembling circle over the dresser, the guest book, the bowed mattress, and the window where my reflection lagged a heartbeat behind, throwing me a delayed look of worry that I didn't have time to return. Rowan was kneeling by the closet as before, only now her hands were cupped like she was scooping from a fountain, and her face was wet, shining not with tears, but with a sheen so thin I thought at first it was sweat until the lantern revealed the truth. Water beaded along her hairline and temples, pearls of it rolling into the hollow of her throat and dripping from her fingers into the black of the closet the way rain runs back into the earth. "Stop," I said too softly, because the house listens for commands and bends them into invitations, and she raised her head with a slow grace that made me think of sleepwalkers and saints, eyes too bright, teeth too white, and whispered, "I'm paying," with that doubled voice, hers and the house's, layered so carefully I felt an urge to apologize like I'd interrupted a conversation between hosts. The closet breathed, a sound like a lung behind a wall, and the inward-facing wood bulged minutely, a pulse I could almost match with my own, and everything in me screamed to grab her, to slam the door, to drag her down the stairs and out into the crooked orchard rows where at least the rules are sky and wind. But I didn't move, because second rules are sharp and unforgiving, and I have learned every corner of their teeth. Instead, I looked for a lever I could safely pull, something the house had given me: ritual, numbers, water, names. "Count to 10, I said, catching hold of that habit. "With me, okay?" And started without waiting. 1, 2, 3, and she nodded, as if she'd been waiting for me to speak to the air itself. And on 4, the hall bulb flashed once, a single slow blink like an animal acknowledging prey. And on 5, the radio downstairs went silent, blessedly, unnervingly silent. And on 6, the bay room window fogged in a perfect oval as if something were pressing a face to it from the night, and my own delayed reflection leaned closer to inspect me, lips forming a shape my mouth hadn't made. Water. And when I reached 7, Rowan's cupped hands filled again from thin air, water condensing, beating, pooling as if summoned by heat, and she tipped that handful into the closet's dark, and the wood sighed, sated for a beat, and the smell of old apples bloomed through the room, sweet and rotten,
the orchard visiting to witness its tithe being met. By 8, my lantern flame thinned to a hair and the hall beyond the door became a longer hall than the blueprint knows, stretching into a perspective that made my stomach slosh, and 9 scraped my throat like a dry swallow, and 10, on 10, the downstairs faucet sneezed a single drop that I heard as clearly as if my ear were pressed to the spout. And it was so absurd, so household. I almost laughed, except the sound that escaped me was too sharp and too close to breaking. "There," Rowan breathed, lowering her hands. And for an instant, she looked like a person who had eaten and found the edge off their hunger. But then the closet answered with a second breath, deeper, greedy, and the wet on her skin retreated as if sucked, and she shivered in a way that made my own shoulders draw tight. "It's not done," she murmured, not to me, to the house. Apologetic, a guest who wants to leave a good review after bad service. And I hated it, the posture of it, the way it made my throat tight with the protective anger that had nowhere to go. "Listen," I said, and chose the only weapon the house respects, the printed law. Rule 4 is a finish line, a full glass on the kitchen table, untouched, at checkout. Not a sip, not a trickle. If we satisfy that, it stops. It lets go. Saying it lets go felt like telling a storm to dry up, but the orchard house loves phrases with shape. It believes them long enough that you sometimes survive. Rowan blinked, her eyes clearing of that high lacquer like someone had wiped them with a cloth. And for the first time since the glasses downstairs, she sounded like herself. "And if it doesn't? Then it drinks the nearest mirror," I said before I could keep the lie tucked away. And her gaze flicked to the bay window where my reflection leaned in, helpful as a tutor, mouthing water again, and back to me. And in that looped glance, I saw the house's gambit. It wanted to make her finish here, to move the rule upstairs where it preferred to feed, so the kitchen table would be waiting forever with an empty place setting, and we would leave thirsty because we had obeyed almost correctly. I took the lantern and, breaking a superstition that says never to put your light on the floor because it becomes someone else's candle, set it in the doorway where the threshold could steal some of its nerve. And I offered her my hand. I don't know why I did it. Maybe because I'm tired of counting alone. Maybe because I hate the voice the house puts in my mouth when I'm scared. But she took it, finger still cold, and I guided her away from the closet that still breathed like a wall full of tide. And the door didn't try to swing, didn't creak, it simply waited, polite as a trap. In the hall, the bulb burned steadily again. Too steadily, like it wanted us to trust the light. And we walked past it anyway, down the stairs where step 10 was warmer again. Someone else had crossed here recently. And into the kitchen where the 3 glasses had become 2. 1 brimming, 1 empty upside down, a snub and a dare, and next to them the red thread now wrapped around a cherry twig twice, as if binding a promise. We finished the rule, I said to the room, to the house, to whatever listened through the pipework and plaster, and I filled a clean tumbler from the tap, watching the stream for any flicker, any shimmer of language, but it ran plain and clear. And when the glass was full, I set it dead center on the table, nudging it until its circle of condensation matched an old water ring exactly, like slipping a coin into a worn groove. "Untouched," I said and stepped back. The radio upstairs or downstairs or inside the walls sighed a single harmonic, like a throat clearing before a story, then fell quiet, and the porch swing outside scraped once, as if someone had stood from it. We waited. Waiting in the orchard house is its own rule, the unwritten fifth that's really just a test of whether you can endure your own heartbeat. Rowan squeezed my hand and her fingers warmed for the first time. The bay window, 2 rooms away, released its fogged oval by degrees. A drip tapped somewhere in the pipes, but not the kitchen tap. And then, delicately, as a change in breathing, everything aligned. The rose in the orchard, the seam in the hall runner, the crack in the pantry door, and I knew, with the clarity that comes after fever, that the house had accepted the offering we should have given last time. "Paid," Rowan whispered, and it sounded like wind moving through a story older than both of us. And for a heartbeat, I believed this was an ending, a contained ritual with edges, until the oven clock sighed and slid from 3:10 to 3:11, even though it was nowhere near that hour, and the hall bulb dimmed to a candle, and from upstairs, from the bay room, the closet knocked once, gently, grateful, and a second time, curious, and a third, patient,
and the brimming glass on the table trembled without spilling, and the house, sated but not finished, tilted its head like a host about to ask a favor that sounds like a kindness.
By the time morning should have arrived, I knew better than to expect sunlight to mean safety, because the orchard house doesn't open its curtains to the real sky unless it chooses to, and that day, it chose not to, leaving every window fogged with a dull gray sheen, as if the world outside had been erased, and Rowan and I sat at the kitchen table with the untouched brimming glass of water between us like it was a live grenade neither of us wanted to touch. She hadn't spoken since the closet's third knock, her eyes fixed on the condensation sliding down the glass in slow lines that reminded me of veins. And though I wanted to tell her it was over, that we had followed Rule 4 and were safe, the radio betrayed me, humming a low tone under the silence like a held breath. And I knew the house hadn't finished. It had only paused, waiting for the right time to show its teeth again. "You said it remembers," I whispered finally, and Rowan blinked at me like she'd been somewhere far away, her voice rough when she replied, "It never forgets a debt." And I shivered because the way she said it made me wonder if she was speaking about the house or herself. And before I could ask, the porch swing outside let out one long creak and then went still, perfectly still, like someone had stood up and stepped onto the gravel. But when I moved to the window and wiped away the fog with my sleeve, all I saw was the orchard lined in an impossible symmetry, the rows of trees angling inward to form a tunnel that hadn't been there before, a passage carved in branches and shadow leading away from the house like a throat leading down. "Don't go in alone," I told her automatically, the words spilling out of me before I realized I'd said them. And she laughed softly, bitterly, saying, "That's not one of the printed rules, Ethan." And I wanted to argue, to insist it should have been, but the orchard seemed to be listening, the branches trembling faintly, even though there was no wind, and I realized the house was giving us a choice, or at least the illusion of one. I should have barred the door. I should have smashed the glass on the table and scattered its contents across the floor, but instead, I let her open the kitchen door and step onto the porch with me trailing behind, the air colder than it should have been, the gravel crunching under our feet like bones. And when we reached the fence, the orchard rose pulsed, yes, pulsed, aligning into a straight line that drew the eye to its vanishing point. And Rowan whispered, "That's where it waits," like she was remembering instead of guessing. I wanted to hold her back, but my hand wouldn't rise, because the house doesn't like interference once it's set the stage. And so we walked, together, into that green-black tunnel of branches, the smell of apples souring the deeper we went, until the sound of the house itself faded behind us, and all I could hear was our breathing and the occasional flutter of something moving ahead, always just out of reach. The orchard path narrowed the further we followed it, and I felt the branches brush against my shoulders, even though they didn't move, as though they were leaning closer to listen. And after what could have been minutes or hours, we came to a clearing, circular and perfectly symmetrical, and in the center stood a chair, just like the one in the bay room, except this one was carved from twisted wood and roots, its seat damp with something dark that smelled of rust and rain. I froze, her hand tightening around mine, and whispered, "I sat there once." And the breath left my lungs because I realized this wasn't her first visit, not really. It was her return, her second attempt to finish what she'd left undone, and the house had simply waited, patient as stone, until she brought herself back. "Don't sit," I told her, my voice breaking, but she was already moving, drawn toward it like iron to a magnet. And when she lowered herself onto the seat, the orchard sighed in unison, every branch shifting as though stretching after a long sleep, and her eyes rolled back for a moment before fixing on mine, steady and sure, and she whispered, "It wants water, Ethan. It always wants water." And the ground beneath us groaned, the soil splitting just enough to release the sound of rushing liquid far below, like an underground river waking up. And I thought for a moment that maybe, just maybe, we could satisfy it here, pour a full glass and leave it. But when I glanced back, the path we'd entered by was gone, sealed by a wall of trunks that hadn't been there a second ago. And I understood that the orchard wasn't asking, it was keeping us, waiting to see which one of us would pay next. I stood frozen, lantern clutched tight, watching as Rowan's fingers traced the armrest of the chair, carving lines into the wood that looked too deliberate to be random. And the smell of peppermint and pennies returned, stronger now, as if the closet's breath had followed us outside. And I realized with a sinking dread that the orchard house and the orchard itself weren't separate. They were one, roots and beams woven together, rules only the surface of something much deeper. And Rowan leaned forward, her face pale and damp, and whispered,
If I leave water, it lets me go. If I don't, it follows me forever. And when I asked, voice cracking, and what if neither of us leaves it? She smiled faintly, eyes dark, and said, then it drinks us both. And the orchard around us creaked, branches groaning in agreement, as though it had been waiting for me to finally understand the real rule, the one never written, the one you only learn when it's far too late.
I stood there in the clearing with Rowan seated in that chair of roots, the air around us heavy as wet cloth, and every instinct in me screamed to run. But there was nowhere to go, because the path we'd entered by was gone. The trees fused together in a wall of bark and shadow, and the only light came from my trembling lantern casting crooked shapes against the orchard walls, shapes that didn't quite match our bodies. And Rowan leaned back in the chair like she belonged there, her hands gripping the twisted armrests as if they were alive. And maybe they were, because I could swear I saw the wood pulse faintly beneath her fingers like a heartbeat. And her face had changed too, calmer now, her eyes half-lidded like she was listening to something I couldn't hear. And when she finally spoke, her voice was lower, layered with something else. It remembers you, Ethan, she whispered, and my throat tightened, because I had always thought of myself as the caretaker, the one who observed and enforced the rules, never the one bound to them. But the way she said it made me realize the house had never cared about roles. It cared about offerings, and every caretaker was just another coin tossed into its well. The ground beneath us gave a long groan, and the soil split in a jagged circle around the chair, revealing a black gap where water glimmered faintly far below. Not clear water, but thick and dark, reflecting the lantern flame in ways that bent the light wrong. And I felt it calling, not with words, but with thirst, a hunger so deep it made my tongue ache. And the rules rushed through my head like a mantra. Always check in after dark. Never open a door you didn't close. If the hall light flickers, count to 10. Leave a glass of water on the table. And for the first time I understood they weren't protections, they were payments. Small sips the house demanded to stave off the steeper thirst. And we were standing at the bottom of its well. Rowan's head tilted back, and her lips parted like she was drinking from the air itself. And I stepped forward, shaking, lantern rattling in my grip, and hissed, "Don't!" But she only smiled, water beating on her cheeks from nowhere, dripping down her chin and falling into the black gap where it vanished with a sound that wasn't a splash but a hiss, like steam escaping. And the orchard shuddered around us, branches rattling in applause. And I realized she wasn't giving her own water, she was giving mine. Because my throat burned dry, my lips cracked, and every swallow I tried to take came up empty, as though she'd siphoned it straight out of me. And I staggered back gasping, whispering no over and over. But the orchard didn't listen. It only leaned closer, branches lowering like an audience craning to see the stage. The radio's hum rose faintly in the distance, even though the house was nowhere in sight, and I hated that it could still reach us here. Hated that its voice threaded through the roots underfoot, binding orchard and walls and rules into one living thing. "You have to give it something too," Rowan murmured, her eyes glowing faint in the lantern light, "or it won't let you leave." And I knew she was right, because the orchard house doesn't deal in halves. It takes from both, always. And if I tried to leave unpaid, it would follow me out into the world, tapping at my windows, drinking from my reflection until there was nothing left of me but thirst. The clearing tilted then, or maybe my vision did, because suddenly I saw other chairs in the dark, half buried in the soil at the edges, and in them slumped shapes, outlines of people, some only bones, others dried and shrunken like fruit left too long on the branch. And at their feet sat empty glasses, cracked and broken, offerings that had never been enough. And bile rose in my throat at the thought that every glowing 5-star review online might have been written by someone who left just before this step. Someone who paid enough to walk away, but never dared write the truth. I stumbled toward Rowan, desperate, reaching for her shoulders, but the closer I got, the heavier the air became, pressing down like water, and the lantern flame bent sideways as if underwater too. And when I finally touched her, she was cold. Colder than she should have been, like she was part of the chair now. Veins of bark rising faintly along her wrists. And she whispered again, not in her own voice, but in mine, my exact tone, my cadence. "Leave water on the table." And hearing my own voice come out in her mouth nearly buckled my knees. I wanted to scream that I had, that the glass was still brimming on the kitchen cable back in the house, but the orchard knew better. It always knows better. And the glass there was just the appetizer. It wanted the real thing, here, now, from me. The black gap below the chair shimmered again, rippling in patterns that almost looked like letters,
like it was spelling out drink in a language older than words. And my throat burned so dry I thought I might kneel down and press my lips to that darkness if it promised release. But then Rowan's eyes snapped wide, sharp with sudden clarity, and she gasped, Don't let it take both of us." And the orchard groaned angrily at her defiance, branches cracking, leaves hissing like snakes, and the chair shuddered under her as if trying to root her in place. I grabbed her arms with everything left in me and pulled, yanking her out of the chair, the bark on her skin tearing as it resisted, and the lantern fell sideways onto the soil, light flaring wildly. And for a heartbeat, the orchard recoiled, shadows jerking back as though the flame had cut them, and I used that breath of space to drag Rowan toward the wall of trunks where the path had once been, shouting in my head, "Doors only open if you close them," over and over, hoping the house was listening. The branches tightened, but then, with a sound like a latch clicking, a narrow slit opened in the tree wall, barely wide enough to squeeze through, and I didn't think I just shoved her through, then forced myself after, the bark scraping my shoulders as the orchard hissed and the chair behind us groaned like something denied its meal. And when I tumbled onto the gravel path beyond, Rowan gasping beside me, the lantern clattering to the ground but miraculously still lit, I realized we were back at the orchard house, standing in the yard, the porch looming above us, and the brimming glass still waiting on the kitchen table through the window, glinting faintly like an eye, patient, eternal, reminding me that no matter how far we thought we'd gone, the house was never behind us. It was everywhere its rules were remembered, and I had just promised it far more than I meant to.
We stumbled back onto the porch like survivors of a shipwreck, Rowan coughing, her face streaked with dirt and sap, my chest heaving like I'd been sprinting for miles, even though the orchard had spit us out only a few steps from where we'd begun, and the lantern in my hand guttered but clung to life, its flame dimming just enough to make the shadows seem bolder. And when I turned to the kitchen window, the sight of that brimming glass still sitting on the table sent a cold weight sliding into my stomach because it was waiting, untouched, patient, as if mocking the desperate fight we'd just endured. Rowan leaned against the porch rail, whispering through ragged breaths, "It won't stop. It knows we didn't finish." And I wanted to tell her she was wrong, that the orchard had taken enough, that the chair had claimed its tithe, but the radio inside betrayed me, humming a low, steady note, like a throat preparing to speak. And I knew she was right, because the orchard house never mistakes half payments for full ones, and whatever bargain we thought we'd made was still open, still binding. I unlocked the door with trembling hands, the brass key thrumming like a trapped insect, and when we stepped inside, the air felt different, heavier, as if the house had grown thicker walls while we were gone, sealing us into its stomach. And the hallway stretched too far, the runner on the floor narrowing into perspective lines that seemed endless, but I forced us toward the kitchen anyway, needing to face the glass, needing to see if we could still satisfy Rule 4. When we reached the table, the untouched water gleamed in the lantern light, perfectly still, perfectly clear. But something was wrong. The reflection wasn't ours. It was darker, deeper, showing two figures hunched and broken, their faces hollowed out, their mouths open like they were screaming underwater. And when I leaned closer, the water rippled, though I hadn't touched it, and the figures inside rippled too, as if they'd noticed me and were straining to break free. "Don't look too long," Rowan hissed, jerking me back, and I blinked, realizing my throat had gone dry again, thirst gnawing at me like invisible hands. And she was right. The house was luring me, tempting me to drink, but the rules never once said drink. They said leave. And so I forced myself to step back and whispered, "Untouched," like a prayer, hoping the word had weight here. The upstairs hall light flickered suddenly, once, twice, then a frantic stutter of pulses, and I grabbed Rowan's hand and whispered, "Count." And together we chanted numbers into the air like fools. 7, 8, 9, 10. And when we reached 10, the bulb steadied again,
But the silence that followed was worse than the flicker, a silence thick and swollen, filled with waiting. And then came the knock. It echoed from above, deliberate, measured. 3 raps against the bay room closet, and Rowan flinched like she'd been struck, whispering, "It's calling me." And I shook my head violently, insisting, "No, it's calling us both," because I had begun to understand the cruelest truth of the orchard house, that it never let its caretakers remain caretakers, that in time the rules turned inward, binding you not as a guide, but as an offering. And tonight it had written my name into its debt ledger alongside hers. The knock came again, softer this time, coaxing instead of commanding. And though I wanted to stay in the kitchen with the lantern in the water, I knew the house wouldn't let us rest until we answered, so I led Rowan up the stairs, each step groaning like a protest, the brass key warm in my pocket, the lantern flame shrinking as if suffocating. And when we reached the bay room door, it was already ajar, the carpet leading inside wet with condensation, and I hated myself for stepping across the threshold, but I did, because the rules had made me obedient, because the house had trained me too well. The closet looms at the far wall, shut but trembling faintly, its wood flexing inward as if something pressed from the other side, and Rowan froze before it, whispering, "It wants me to open it." And I hissed back, "No, never open a door you didn't close." But even as I said it, I felt the rule bend in my mind, twisting. Because wasn't it true that if she had left it ajar years ago, then maybe it counted as hers? Maybe opening it now would only be finishing what she started? And the thought made me sick, because that's how the orchard house works. It doesn't break rules. It changes how you understand them until they snap on their own. Rowan's eyes glazed, her hand rising toward the knob, and I grabbed her wrist, shouting, "Don't!" But the knob turned anyway, not by her strength or mine, but by the will of the house itself. And with a slow groan, the closet creaked open an inch, then 2, revealing not darkness, but a reflection of the room we stood in, only wrong. The wallpaper peeling in reverse, the lantern flame moving a second behind, and in that mirrored space stood 2 figures that looked like us, only older, drained, hollow-eyed, their lips moving silently in pleas I couldn't hear. And my stomach dropped because I realized the orchard house wasn't just a place, it was a cycle, a loop, feeding on the versions of us who had failed before, and we were staring at the proof. Rowan whimpered, pulling back, and I slammed the door shut with everything I had, breaking rule 2 but not caring, not anymore. And the house screamed, yes, screamed, a vibration through every board and nail, a howl of rage at being denied. And the lantern blew out, plunging us into blackness. I groped for Rowan, found her hand, ice cold and trembling, and whispered in the dark, "We finish the rule. We leave water on the table untouched. We leave." And together we stumbled back down the stairs, blind but moving, as the house groaned and twisted around us, stretching the hallway longer, the kitchen farther, until I thought we'd never reach it. But at last the table appeared out of the dark, the brimming glass still waiting, the condensation forming words now, "Choose." And I knew the house wasn't going to let both of us leave. It wanted one to pay fully and the other to carry the story back out into the world. And I stood there shaking, Rowan clinging to me, the rules crashing in my head like broken glass, knowing that whatever choice we made next would decide which one of us the orchard house would drink forever.
I stood in the kitchen of the orchard house with Rowan clutching my arm, the lantern dead at our feet, the untouched glass on the table glowing faintly with condensation that spelled "choose," and my heart slammed against my ribs because I finally understood the cruelest secret of this place. The rules were never about escape. They were about division, about forcing someone to carry the debt forward while another stayed behind. And the brimming glass wasn't an offering anymore, it was a judgment.
and if I left it there untouched, one of us would go free while the other would never walk out, bound to the house like all those silent shapes in the orchard chairs. Rowan's lips brushed my ear and she whispered, "It has to be me, Ethan. I broke the rule years ago. I forgot the water. I left thirsty. It remembers." And she started to step toward the table, but I grabbed her wrist, shaking my head violently because I couldn't bear the thought of leaving her here. Not when I'd seen the bark crawling along her skin, not when I'd heard my own voice echo through her mouth. Because if she stayed, the house wouldn't just drink her, it would wear her, parade her through the orchard for every guest who followed, and I'd never forgive myself for being the one who let it happen. "No," I hissed, pulling her back. "We'll trick it. We'll both leave together." But even as I said it, the house groaned around us, the porch swing scraping against the night air, the upstairs hall bulb flickering madly, and the radio muttering our names in overlapping whispers as if mocking my defiance. And Rowan's eyes filled with tears that looked like glass beads, not salt water, and she shook her head, murmuring, "You can't trick it, Ethan. It always gets paid." And before I could stop her, she pulled free and pressed both palms against the table, bowing her head as though praying to the glass. And the condensation blurred, reshaping into a crude loop symbol that pulsed once like a heartbeat. Panic took me, raw and stupid, and I snatched the glass before she could, holding it tight in both hands, my throat burning with thirst so sharp it felt like knives. And for one wild second, I thought about drinking it myself, about offering my own body to end the game. But the rules roared through my head, leave a glass of water on the table untouched. And I realized that drinking would only damn us both. So instead, I slammed the glass back down hard enough that water slotched over the rim but didn't spill away. The circle of moisture spreading wider on the wood, and I shouted into the dark, "It's there, untouched, we followed the rule." And the house froze, the air tightening like lungs holding breath, the upstairs hall bulb going still, the radio cutting silence. And for a heartbeat, I thought maybe, just maybe, it had worked. Until Rowan gasped and doubled over, clutching her chest as though something inside her was being wrenched loose, and her eyes rolled white as the condensation on the table split again, this time spelling paid. And I realized with horror that the house hadn't cared who left the water, only that one of us had to embody it, to become the offering itself, and it had chosen her. "No!" I screamed, grabbing her shoulder, shaking her, but her skin was already slick and cold, water pouring from her eyes and mouth in thin streams that splattered across the floor and hissed into the cracks, and her body grew lighter in my arms as if hollowing out, and she looked up at me one last time, her lips forming the word leave without sound, before her body sagged and collapsed into nothing but wet clothing and steam rising faintly toward the ceiling, absorbed into the beams above. The brimming glass on the table shimmered, still full, untouched, mocking me with its perfect circle of condensation, and the house exhaled in a satisfied groan that rattled every window pane, the orchard outside swaying though no wind stirred, and I understood then that Rowan had been the final offering, the one to pay the debt, and the rules had been satisfied, at least for now. Shaking, sobbing, I staggered toward the door, the brass key hot in my pocket, and when I opened it, the air outside was crisp and real, sunlight breaking at last through the fog, and the orchard rows had returned to their natural crookedness, harmless, ordinary, as if the night before had been nothing but a fever dream. I stumbled into the gravel drive, gasping at the ordinary sound of birds in the distance, and when I turned back, the orchard house loomed still, white clapboard glowing in the dawn, windows blank and innocent, the porch swing creaking lazily in a real wind, and on the kitchen table, through the glass, the brimming water waited untouched, a single bead of condensation running down its side like a tear. I wanted to smash it, to burn the house to ash, to rip its roots out of the soil, but I knew better, because the orchard house doesn't burn, doesn't rot, doesn't end. It waits, it remembers, and it writes new rules whenever it pleases, and I was the last caretaker alive to tell them, the one chosen to carry Rowan's story into the world. So I turned away, choking on the guilt that she'd paid for both of us, and I whispered to myself as I walked down the road, always check in after dark, never open a door you didn't close. If the upstairs hall light flickers, count to 10 before moving. At checkout, leave a glass of water on the table. Repeating the words like scripture, knowing that someday soon, another booking will appear with no photo, no message, just a name and a time, and I'll be waiting at the gate again, brass key in hand, because the orchard house always collects. And now I think it has started keeping my name on the list too.
And that's where my story ends. Or maybe where it begins again. Because the orchard house never really lets you leave. Not completely. It only waits, patient and thirsty, for the next visitor who dares to book a night. If you enjoyed tonight's tale, check out more terrifying stories right here on Echoes After Midnight. Don't forget to subscribe, hit the bell, and leave a comment. I'd love to know. Would you dare stay in an Airbnb with rules like these?